Welcome to One Room at a Time. I'm your host, Atticus LeBlanc, founder and CEO of PadSplit, the nation's largest co-living marketplace, and I've spent more than 2 decades in affordable housing as a property owner, developer, and now entrepreneur. This show brings together some of the brightest minds in housing, policy, and innovation to talk about what's working, what isn't, and how we can create real solutions to one of the biggest challenges of our time, housing affordability. Joining me today is someone who has been at the center of some of the most important research happening in housing right now. Alex Horowitz is the Director of Housing Policy Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trusts, where he guides research focused on the housing shortage and how it impacts affordability, homelessness, and household well-being. Alex's work examines land use, building codes, permitting, financing, and other barriers that limit housing supply. He's been instrumental in helping policymakers understand how outdated rules make housing more expensive. Before joining Pew, Alex worked in opinion research and communications, and he brings a rare combination of policy and real-world perspective to this issue. He's also a really nice guy, as I happen to know firsthand. Alex, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Hey, great. Glad to be here. Thanks for hosting.
Really appreciate the opportunity for engaging in this convo with you as one of the preeminent researchers on housing, co-living, SROs, etc. Let's start with your journey overall, and tell us how you ended up focusing on a career in housing policy and what exactly led you to your current role at Pew.
Sure. So I've been at Pew for almost 15 years already, and I was mostly working in consumer finance issues at Pew before I was working on housing policy. And our lens in our portfolio was the household budget. So we were working on credit products and payments and how people save money. But look, the biggest line item in a household budget, by far, it's housing.
Sure.
And so when we were looking to expand our work, we began working on housing finance because we have serious issues with consumers financing housing. Mortgage access has gotten much tighter than it was in the past. Small mortgages under $150,000 have gotten really hard to get. We see people using land contracts, rent-to-own agreements, and non-mortgage loans to try to buy homes. But then as we started that work, look, the housing shortage and the fact that housing's gotten so expensive is just hanging over everything. And that brought us from really using a household budget frame to moving into the housing shortage, because when we are thinking about the household budget, it's just dominated by housing costs.
Yeah. Something that I wonder a lot about researchers, I'm going to put you on the spot, Alex, because I mean, your whole professional career is around doing professionalized research, but I'm sure you must have a lot of life experience and just anecdotal things that you see in your everyday course of life that impact a lot of that work. So, like, how do you reconcile those two things with what you see, feel, read on a daily basis versus the research that you do?
Sure. I think I live in Washington, D.C. I think that anyone who's living in an expensive city just sees homelessness around them.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, and that's part of what affects them. I grew up in the New York suburbs, going into Manhattan, 1980s, 1990s. I had no idea that homelessness was new.
Yeah.
At that time. That was just finding out later that homelessness was relatively new was shocking to me, absolutely shocking. And the issue of homelessness is part of what brought me to this space, as I made the connection between the housing shortage and the fact that housing's gotten so much more expensive than it used to be, and we've lost our supply of low-cost housing and homelessness. So that's definitely an issue that, for me, kind of just bridges my everyday experience with what I'm researching and reading and writing about.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that too. I'm consistently shocked at the fact that it is still a debatable topic or a research topic at all, that housing and homelessness are connected. And I'm curious to know, as a researcher, that's got to be frustrating for you, the fact that so many people are saying homelessness is about a lot of other things aside from housing, or that housing isn't necessarily a solution to homelessness. Does that happen at dinner parties where you just kind of pull your hair out, or how do you reconcile that?
Part of how I do research in general is I like to compare places to each other and to see what's happening in different locations. And I think we gain a lot of value from that, because if something is systematically different in one place than another, right, there's something going
Yeah.
on. I mean, right, it is systematic. So there are, there are definitely vulnerabilities that make people more likely not to have a home. But are those vulnerabilities 20 times as prevalent in San Francisco as they are in Houston?
Mm.
Are they 17 times as prevalent in Vermont as they are in Mississippi?
Mm.
It doesn't make any sense. When rents are such a strong predictor of homelessness, it's not illogical that these things go together. But we see that if you're doing research and if you're modeling homelessness, your R squared, your predictive power, comes from housing costs.
Yeah.
And housing costs come from the availability of housing. And when we see within a city, within a county, within a state, when housing costs move, homelessness does too. It's not that personal qualities changed in Raleigh, North Carolina. Housing costs went up and homelessness went up.
Yeah.
Then they made it a lot easier to build, and rent growth moderated sharply, and homelessness started dropping within the jurisdiction. So that's an issue where we definitely still have some more work to do to break through to policymakers and the public. And that one hasn't been, I think, quite as intuitive for some stakeholders as, say, rents and overall housing supply, because there are other sentiments, I think,
Sure.
that get caught up with homelessness, but the statistical evidence just couldn't be more clear.
Yeah. Well, that's a great line that I'm going to take from this, and I hope our listeners do, that when housing prices went up, homelessness went up. Like, I think that's pretty unequivocal. And listen, I mean, so affordability is one of the hottest topics, not just of this year. It's been ongoing for a while, but certainly seems like it will be the key political issue for this year. Just curious to hear your thoughts on what you're hearing and seeing about just the housing affordability discussion so far, and why the message either is or is not resonating in the way that it should.
To me, I see this resonating. So I do think that housing affordability really is central to people thinking about affordability broadly, simply because it's what they spend the most money on. Historically, the median home price is about 3 years of the median income in the U.S.,
Mm-hmm.
and that tends to track across markets and neighborhoods. So 3 years, 3.5 at most years of median income has just been the median home price in the U.S. For a long time. And then we've seen that relationship break. So now we're around 5 years of income for the median home price. Mm-hmm. Historically, you see about a quarter of renters spending more than 30% of income on rent, about maybe an eighth of renters spending more than 50% of income on rent, and both of those have doubled. So now half of renters spend more than 30% of income on rent. And there can be a good reason that why you would spend a greater share of income on rent if you can lower some of your other costs, especially around transportation, because transportation has become the number 2 line item in household budgets. But we're not in a normal time. Housing costs being so expensive, both to rent and to buy, is really out of line with historical price trends. And we can see that it's the shortage that is driving that, because housing affordability is starting to improve in some places that have made it easy to build and had more homes. And in places that haven't, we're seeing the trend lines continue up, where rents continue to rise and prices continue to rise as well.
And I mean, you've been doing this research now for 15 years, Alex, and I'm sure it's got to be infuriating for you. I've heard it from many other researchers. who kind of state and do very similar research showing that there's a lack of housing supply that's ultimately fueling a lot of this affordability crisis. And yet we see very, very rarely local policy reflect those realities. And they all get the same information, right? I mean, I know they go to a lot of the regional commissions to get this data. They're reading reports from Pew, and yet we still don't see the local policy changes that would generally enable more supply to be created. Why do you think that's such a struggle or disconnect?
So I should say I've only been working on the housing shortage for not even 3 years. So I personally feel like things are moving really fast.
You were in the right time.
I got in at the right time. From 2011 to 2016, all states combined in the U.S. passed an average of one law a year to allow more homes. 2017 to 2022, all states combined passed an average of 18 laws a year to allow more homes. 2023, 2024, all states combined passed an average of 48 laws a year to allow more homes. In 2025, states passed more than 100 laws to allow more homes. So to me, it feels like this is moving.
That's
like
good.
We are in business. Going into the 2023 state legislative session, some states had taken action, but it's really just felt like a groundswell the last 3 years. So as someone who's only been working on this for not quite 3 years, it feels like things are moving pretty quickly, and that the understanding of this issue has gotten a lot better in the past few years. I think some of that is that we've got better data, and that there are researchers who have published more on this and more accessible research. I've seen that state policymakers usually don't respond very well to p-values, coefficients, standard errors, R-squareds, and just respond a lot better to dollars and percent changes and metrics that make sense to their constituents and that fit with their everyday experience.
Yeah. Well, and you were mentioning states specifically. I was thinking about localities versus states, because one of the other big trends that the audience may or may not be aware of is that historically localities have been the one to affect changes with regard to building, permitting, zoning, supply overall. But more and more recently, as you alluded to, we're seeing states actually take this action. Do you have any insight as to why you think that is? Is it just indicative of the size of the crisis?
I think that state policymakers have realized that if they're going to wait for localities to take care of this on their own, they're going to be waiting an awfully long time.
Yeah.
There are localities who are moving forward, and that is hugely valuable. A decade ago, there really weren't any jurisdictions of size that had eliminated their parking minimums, for example. Now we've got more than 100 localities that have eliminated their parking minimums.
Right on.
That is a big deal. Overall, there is a really strong connection between regional housing supply and local rents.
Sure.
Local housing supply doesn't affect local rents as much as regional housing supply affects local rents. So no locality can solve this problem on their own. It's great when localities act, and they should, and bigger cities can have a bigger impact. But if a town of 10,000 or 15,000 makes it easier to build apartments, and none of the towns around them do the same, the affordability impact is going to be positive, but marginal.
Yeah.
Now, when a state acts, and now suddenly accessory dwelling units are allowed everywhere. 18 states have passed an accessory dwelling unit law to allow them everywhere. 15 states have passed a law to allow apartments on all commercially zoned land or near transit stops. Policies like that are enacted statewide can just move the needle more than any individual locality can do so on their own, because the localities around you have to act too.
Sure.
Now, if it's a bigger city, right? If it's Atlanta, if it's Austin, you can have an impact as a city there, but state action gets the suburbs into the game.
Yeah.
It gets the other cities into the game too. And that's where we could really start to push down housing costs and bring them back in line with historical norms.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you bring up Atlanta. I mean, it may be it maybe prove your original point in terms of the need for statewide action. We have 83 different jurisdictions here, right? I mean, the population of Atlanta is only around 500,000 people, even though you're talking about round about 6.5 million people in the metro area. So a lot there, similar to DC. Of course, you guys can't rely on statewide action, obviously, but as you look at Maryland, Virginia, and all the different municipalities there, it's quite a web of not necessarily connected regulations that ultimately control housing affordability. Talking about affordability, though, and moving on to SRO work, which has been a lot of your recent stuff. I know you've done some extensive research on SROs. Excuse me, for those in the audience who don't know, SRO, single resident occupancy, and for listeners who may not be familiar, what role did SROs play historically in American cities, and what did we lose when we essentially regulated them out of existence?
So throughout American history, boarding was very common, and the unit of housing often was a room. So estimates are that in the early 1900s, somewhere between a third and a half of residents of cities either had rented an individual room or they had rented out a room in their home. This was just a very, very common way to live.
Did you say a third to a half?
That's right.
Wow.
And not on any given day, but had at some point
over the course
in time,
of their
right? Rented
housing.
a room, an individual room in a house or in a building, or they had rented out a room in their house. So this was extremely common. Even into the mid-1900s, about a tenth of the rental housing stock was SROs, individual rooms, in major cities. A tenth of the rental housing stock in the mid-1900s. And then that was really good for mobility because it let people move from place to place and get a foothold in a city even before they had a steady job because they could find something that was cheap.
Who are these people, Alex? Like I mean, when you talk about either a third to a half or 10% of the entire housing stock, who's living in these things in, call it 1900 to 1955?
So, I mean, earlier in American history, I mean, pretty much everyone.
Yeah.
Right? This was just a very common way to live. And whether people lived in hotels or, I mean, the vice president used to live in a hotel room.
Sure. Well, I remember my go-tos are Alexander Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Jackson, Thomas Jefferson, all rented rooms at some point.
That's right. And I mean, literally the vice president, while serving as vice president, typically lived in a hotel room.
Oh, nice.
as the vice president. So it was very common, but also this was a way for people to move to a new city. And whether that was moving from a rural area or moving from another city for an opportunity, basically because rooms were cheap. And one of the shocking figures to me, using data from Paul Groth's seminal work, Living Downtown, we adjusted those for inflation and used the SRO prices that he listed in his book and using the Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation calculator, adjusted them for 2025. And SROs were typically about $100 to $300 a month in today's dollars.
Wow.
Now, the quality usually was not very good. Rooms were small, often under 80 square feet. They didn't have air conditioning, even after air conditioning became more common, right? Like bathrooms were down the hall and shared. Quality was not great. Residents did complain that they could hear each other, not much soundproofing between the rooms, but there was something. And so it was a way for people to move from place to place. I think there has been more interest in economic mobility. Yoni Applebaum's book, Stuck, got a lot of attention in 2025 about how Americans used to move frequently for opportunity and not so much anymore. And that's probably slowed down economic growth because it slowed down economic mobility. So people don't live where they can earn the most and are most productive. And as we lost our SRO housing stock because it was typically zoned out of existence, New York City was the first big city to ban new SROs. They did so in 1955. And then other cities followed suit, or if they didn't ban them, then they made them very difficult to create. They mandated larger unit sizes. They required people to have their own bathroom. The building codes and fire codes required landlords to enact upgrades, but there was no subsidy money to do that, and tenants couldn't afford to pay higher rents. So then SROs became unprofitable, so landlords didn't operate them anymore. And so as we lost our SRO housing stock in the 1950s, but then especially the 60s and 70s, homelessness was almost non-existent in the US from the late 1940s until the late 1970s. And then as SROs disappeared, homelessness emerged. One survey of residents moving into New York City homeless shelter in 1980 found that half were moving directly from an SRO into the shelter because the city was pushing its SROs out of existence through restrictive zoning, the ban on creating new ones, and making building codes more expensive without providing subsidy money to do so.
Have you guys released anything on that, on the homelessness impact specifically, Alex? It's super interesting to me.
We published a piece on that in this past July 2025 about the history of the decline in SROs and how homelessness emerged. And given the timing and the statistical power, that is by far the biggest reason why we went from having almost no homelessness to having quite a lot of it in short order, because we were just seeing our low-cost, unsubsidized rental housing stock shrink by the month.
Yeah, it also corresponds directly. I show a chart when I give presentations of the per capita housing allocation. So how many square feet does each person use, taking just total housing square footage in the U.S. divided by total population, and you start to see this shift in 1960. In 1950, I think it was 299 square feet per person, but then 60s onward, you see this number jump pretty incredibly, and it corresponds exactly with the time frame that you're referencing. And I hadn't heard. I did read that study, by the way, but I didn't make the connection that this was really the beginning of kind of the homelessness issue across American cities. That it was largely a result of the regulating SROs out of existence. So that's super interesting. I mean, I know now the counter to that, what PadSplit sees. I was pretty surprised. Last year, we did a survey of our own residents that showed 8% told us that they moved directly out of unsheltered homelessness into a PadSplit unit. This year, that number was 9%, actually. And then another 16% were moving out of extended stay motels or shelters or transitional homes. So it absolutely follows, even though, of course, we kind of run the gamut of incomes and demographics and different work types. But yeah, has always been a consistent source of demand for our business is folks who are looking for literally the first step out of homelessness. And so let's talk a little bit about that, though. So SROs versus co-living. You've also done a lot of work on just office co-living. And so curious to know the momentum that you're seeing right now among different housing models like co-living. And maybe you can explain for our audience what the difference is between an SRO and co-living, if there is any, and how do these fit into the broader housing ecosystem?
Sure. I think SROs are a pretty broad term that they could refer to a variety of housing arrangements, where you could be talking about a converted hotel, or I could be talking about essentially a boarding house where it's a single family home and there are multiple individual rooms for rent. And then co-living, specifically as we're talking about it, we did work with the architecture firm Gensler, and we were looking at office to residential conversions in the US. Office to residential conversions are great when they happen, but they've been underwhelming. I think if we look back at 2020, when the office vacancy rate really starts to increase sharply after COVID takes root, then I think we would have expected more office to residential conversions by now. There have been some. And look, in Manhattan, where you can charge $10,000 a month for a 3-bedroom apartment, you can make them work.
Yeah.
Right. That just means that there's a lot of money to spend on the conversion.
High demand, low supply, as they say, right?
Exactly. And so you can make that work. But in most places, the conversion costs are quite high for office to residential conversions. And we worked with Gensler because we were interested in what a low-cost conversion would look like, where you could convert office buildings into relatively inexpensive housing. And we found that by leaving the plumbing where it already usually is in an office building in the middle of the floor creates major cost savings on the conversion. Distributing the plumbing into every unit is one of the expensive parts of converting an office building into apartments. And so leaving the plumbing in the middle of the floor and putting the kitchens there, the laundry there, the bathrooms there, which can be individual but shared bathrooms, then that creates major cost savings. And you can reduce the per square foot construction costs by a good 25 to 35% by keeping that in the middle. Oftentimes, jurisdictions require operable windows for apartments, but trophy office buildings don't have operable windows. The Four Seasons often doesn't have operable windows, but we're requiring operable windows in a building that maybe LEED certified, has HEPA filters, mechanical ventilation. Swapping out windows can absolutely make an office
deal killer.
Conversion impossible.
Yeah, it's a deal killer. And who among us has not slept in their office at some point in their lives, right? I mean, at least I certainly remember in the dog days of early startup, spending many a night in an office building, which was some of the best office space in Atlanta. Thank you, Techstars and Cox, but yeah, officially not approved for any sort of residential. So it is a great irony.
And look, we've got over 1 billion square feet of vacant office space in the U.S. That's not all going to be converted to housing. It's not all going to be converted into co-living. But by converting office buildings into co-living instead of regular apartments, A, you can get about 3 times as many units per floor.
Sure.
And B, the units can be pretty inexpensive. So that is something that can stretch subsidy dollars a lot further. And we found, depending on the city we were looking at, that a building could fit more units, but you could stretch subsidy dollars really 2.5 to 12 times as far by using an office to co-living model as you could with, say, office to studio apartments or ground up studio apartments, because the subsidies needed are pretty shallow. Now, look, unsubsidized low-cost housing is the best option because it's can scale and it's simple and doesn't have a complicated capital stack. And we want to get as much housing as we can because people need it. But if you're looking at subsidized housing, this is a way to get a whole lot more of it for the same dollar.
Yeah. Well, and you and I have talked about this before, I know, Alex. I don't know if it's a discussion or a debate, but I know I've always challenged you to say, well, look, Alex, the cheapest housing to convert is the one that's already designed for housing and taking advantage of these empty bedrooms. But it's all needed.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I think, we have a lot of needs for more housing. 63% of households in the U.S. have 1 or 2 people in them, but the large majority of our housing stock is single family detached and is only occupied by a single family. So at a time that we've got a record number of empty bedrooms in the U.S. and a record housing shortage, we need to take advantage of those too and make it easier for people to share all types of homes as they have for most of American history.
Did you say 63% only have one or two people? Is that right?
Yeah, 63% of households in the U.S. have 1 or 2 people in them. 68% of renter households only have 1 or 2 people in them.
And I remember reading a stat somewhat recently that only around 13% of existing units are designed as 1 bedrooms. Do you happen to know that one offhand?
I don't. 23, 24% of housing is multifamily
total
overall. In general.
Yeah.
I don't know the breakdown of studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and so on.
Yeah, there was a great AARP study called Making Room. It's a couple years old now, but at that time I think it was 73.5% of U.S. households don't have kids versus 12.5% of units are 1 bedrooms, which is kind of crazy. So a lot of extra space out there. And yeah, I mean, I know you've spent some time talking about regulations, i.e., windows, operable windows in luxury high rises, and if they're okay for everybody else, why are we saying that when you convert the use from office to housing or hotel to housing that it needs something different? What are some of the other regulatory barriers that you think create blockers without necessarily improving safety or living outcomes generally?
Parking mandates are probably the biggest because 30% of low-income households don't own a car at all. No one in the household owns a car. But if they're renting, they're paying for a parking spot and maybe two because they're required to. Because parking is bundled in with the rent, the building owner is required to provide those parking spots, whether or not the residents own cars or drive. So parking mandates are probably the biggest impediment to building apartments and co-living. We also see that minimum unit sizes, and which are kind of the equivalent of minimum lot sizes for single-family houses, are a big deal. New York City, for downtown Brooklyn and most of Manhattan, just eliminated their average minimum unit size, which had been one of their impediments to co-living. Limitations on sharing bathrooms and on sharing kitchens. Some places regulate that outright. Also, what are often called like density limits, the number of units per acre that's allowed. That is a huge barrier to co-living, because part of what's nice about co-living is that it's space efficient and more people can share space. But if that's not allowed based on some units per acre count, then that kind of outdated regulation gets in the way of allowing people to share living space and to live where they want at a price they can afford.
Yeah, talking about outdated requirements, I know you and I were sharing emails over the new Golden Girls bill proposed in Pennsylvania, and the number of jurisdictions locally that restrict occupancy based on blood relationship. That's always been one of those that's whether near or dear to my heart or just always raises my blood pressure, but something that we see all over the place. Have you guys ever done any comprehensive research on just how many local jurisdictions regulate based on blood status?
We haven't looked at that, but that is a policy trend. So we are seeing a handful of localities address that and allow more unrelated people to live together, or stop regulating how many people can live together based on family status. But we're also seeing states get involved. So at this point, there are only 4 states that have passed a law statewide to say that localities may not restrict how many people can live together based on family status. Way to go. Iowa, right. Oregon, Colorado, New Hampshire, and Texas for college towns only.
Yep.
But more states should do that. It's good policy, and it takes away one of the regulatory barriers to people being able to share homes and live affordably and use space that already exists. It makes sense for tenants, makes sense for landlords, but there are these limitations on saying only 2 or 3 or 4 roommates are allowed to live together.
Yeah, and then my favorite or least favorite is when there's this this cap on the number of unrelated people, usually between 2 and 4. But there's an allowance for quote unquote domestic servants that still shows up in codes across the country, which I think blows a lot of people's minds, but I find them at least every other week. So
right. So if it's health and safety, hard to explain that one.
Yeah, bingo. Well, we're going to get deeper into regulatory issues and some other more esoteric parts of housing code here in part 2, but it's been a great start to the conversation, and let's pause here. When we come back for part 2, we will get more into just policy momentum, what reforms could meaningfully unlock housing supply. And for our audience, please learn more about Alex's work at pew.org/housing policy. That's PEW.org. And we'll include links to his recent research in the show notes. And don't forget to join us for part 2 of this episode of One Room at a Time. Thanks again, Alex.
Great. Thanks a lot.